Ja, ganz inspirierende Klänge, die wir da gehört haben.
Inspiring sounds that we've heard here from the Babylon Orchestra. Thank you very much for that. And I would suggest we continue inspired here on the stage. You know that we want to continue on the subject of policymaking, practitioners and academia in a trialogue. So first of all, let me thank all three of you up here. You've seen them today. We have the German Minister for Family Affairs, Dr. Giffey. Then we have the President for the National Organization for Civic Education, and we have, the Federal Agency for Civic Education. That's the Vice President, Thomas Krüger, and we have Sinan, Selen, President of the Federal Agency for the Protection of the Office of the Constitution. So thank you very much, because academics have done a great deal to make sure that we address the important issues here at the German Congress on Crime Protection. And of course, we are profiting very much from all of the work that's been done here. So I would say, first of all, let's look at our focus area. You will have heard this already. That is the prevention and democracy building. And there's so many wonderful examples that we cannot touch on all of them, but perhaps we can touch on a couple of ideas. This is certainly something that's important for me. Now, Minister, will you forgive me if I allow the gentleman to speak since you've spoken already? Mr. Krüger, perhaps you could tell us what the most important example of democracy building is for you. Well, there's so many examples, but I think the aspect of participation is so important. And perhaps one of the most wonderful experiences that we've had in recent years is the foundation of a new German organization that demands participation. My favorite is the German Soldiers Association from ethnic minorities who are part of the German armed forces, the Bundeswehr. Make this very clear and make it clear that diversity isn't just something that we see in society as a whole, but also in the institutions that make society up. And I think it's wonderful how young people stand their ground and tell it like it is there. Yes, certainly it might inspire others to look at this issue more closely. So I'll continue with you, Mr. Selen. What is an example that you'd like to share with us? Well, I don't think I've chosen a particular project that I like best for clear reasons. We just said living democracy and making this national program be a permanent one. This was a wonderful step. There are so many different projects that are under a sort of umbrella organization here, and I think that's a real achievement. I used to be in the German Ministry of the Interior, a partner of your ministry, and there were plenty of projects that I looked at, say in Bonn, for example, and to know that these will continue and that they are now permanent and that we can ensure that this work will continue. So I wouldn't want to basically evaluate one individual. There's just such a cornucopia of different projects, which is really impressive. I think we're all very grateful that this is now a permanent program. Have you got some examples? Well, I think about everything that we think about. It's important to be aware of the fact that life takes place on the ground, and what moves people in their ordinary lives is what they experience on their ordinary lives is how they see the state. So whether it's the town hall or whether it's a park that's well taken care of, that's how people experience the state. And it's important to be able to talk to people on the ground. Within the framework of Living Democracy, our national program, we have partnerships for democracy, local partnerships for democracy. And now we've managed to set up the 300th. And these are associations where people in their local communities can become active and say, let's do something together. We're going to get a youth project going, or we're going to clean up our neighborhood, or we're going to go out on the streets and reach out to citizens, or we'll do something for families. They do different things. But at the end of the day, what it means is that it's not about somebody telling them top down how they should do things or doing things for them, but rather empowering people to do something for their own neighborhoods and own communities. And we've got 300 of them now. So this is a wonderful example. And that's leads us into another subject that's really important, because I said we wanted to allow the audience to get a chance to speak. And we have a woman here that is called Elagi diversity in Saxony. I wonder if you could give Ms. Elias the floor now, because of course we'd be interested in knowing what you do, Ms. Kiel, what your work is. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to tell you about our work. We work in the Erzgebirge Mountains, a region that is quite rural, has a lot of small towns and villages. And we've heard a great deal of the fact that we need to have more and better concepts for crime prevention. Now, a concept always sounds like you're forcing something on people. And I think it's incredibly important to involve people when you are drawing up these concepts. And partnerships for democracy, you've already said it, Dr. Giffey, give you a good tool for involving people on the ground in their communities so that they're participating on projects that they have been involved in creating. And we have a further pillar in this. This is youth in participation, youth involvement. And in Saxony, we have 21 different partnerships for democracy. We find it quite hard to reach young people, but we have to work out where they are and get them involved. And one example would be in rural areas are school households. So we go into schools in after-school care and offer the children and young people there the opportunity to sort of experience and initiate democratic processes. And I think we need to do even more and prioritize this more, get more to participate, and also tailor what we do to the needs of the actual people involved. Thank you, Ms. Kiel. Mr. Selen, you've been jotting things down and nodding away. I wanted to ask you something anyway. What feedback would you give to Ms. Kiel, or do you see options for doing something structurally to make things work better? Well, I promise you we didn't coordinate beforehand. This is completely spontaneously. I jotted lots of things down here because what you've described is exactly what needs to be done in the area of prevention of extremism, particularly in the Erzgebirge, it's more right-wing extremist circles, this kind of radicalization, that being in Eastern Germany. Not because there's sort of basic attitudes that get people to be drawn into right-wing extremism, but because there are no alternatives. If we can offer real alternatives to right-wing extremism, I think we will be more successful. But if there are no real alternatives to right-wing extremism, or the funding for projects that do offer alternatives run out, it becomes very difficult. And whether we're talking right-wing extremism or Salafis, they win the day. So on the one hand, yes, I nod in support of you, but also I want to express respect for what you do on the ground. Minister, would you like to add anything? Do you see an opportunity to maybe get something going structurally to make work easier? We're currently working on the new funding guidelines for the next round of Living Democracy, the national campaign. And we've got 3 focus areas that are about strengthening the structures, strengthening diversity, involving young people. We've got a special youth fund, which means that young people can think up a project and get money to make it happen. I think we need to do far, far more. And this is true for the entire social state. It's not just helping people, but also doing capacity building, because participating means you have to have the skills to participate. So we have to let them get involved and do their bit and give something back. When they realize that if they do something themselves, they'll see that it makes a difference if they do what they do, or if they're there, or if they aren't. And we see it again and again. We often have this debate with the young generation. We've got the Fridays for Future movement here for the environment, young people. And what I'm experiencing is that lots of young people do indeed think about their future, about where this country is heading. We had the Youth Policy Congress here. Over 400 were shortlisted to come along for that. We're currently working on a national youth strategy, And we've said there's no point us sitting down in our ministry deciding something. We have to involve the people we're addressing, young people themselves. So for me, it's really important to hear what the issues that are important for them. And we keep hearing they want us to reduce the voting age so that younger teenagers can vote. At the same time, we have to say civic education is important to get young people to participate in things. Without civic education, we're not going to get anywhere. So we have to think about how we can transmit history. And I mean, it's 30 years since the fall of the wall, 70 years since the basic law, the Constitution. And lots of people don't know what happened 30 years ago, 70 years ago. So you, in the Agency for Civic Education, have a lot to do, don't you? Well, as you said, it is important to create a situation where young people can get involved. Well, wouldn't want to be reduced to extremism prevention or transmitting the lessons of history in our Agency for Civic Education. I'd like to say that this idea of participation is one that I think is actually key. But if you want to make a statement about how project work can be tweaked and communicated publicly, then we have to say that we are not targeting the people we want to reach as people who endanger democracy, but rather as people who are impacted on by it. And so it's about proactively understood civic education, the way you're describing it. And it's not so much the prevention concept behind it. So in the field of civic education and prevention, if you're looking about the actual terms, there are difficulties. And I think in the next 2 days, maybe we can define what we mean by civic education and what we mean by prevention, because both are legitimate, but we need to describe exactly what we're trying to achieve.
So when you want to involve younger people and older people, then at the beginning, this is a rather open scenario. So we say in civic education, we don't say that we are neutral. Civic education has never been neutral in its whole history in Germany. We are talking about the necessity of having diverse position, controversy. And so we have got different opinions which have to peacefully coexist. So civic education doesn't mean neutrality, but rather a very committed management of diversity in our society. And here I need to bring people on board the way they are, how they want to engage in society, how they want to position themselves in society, and not pre-describe a certain expected behavior for the people. This wouldn't be civic education. Civic education is an open concept. Democracy can further develop. Democracy can put different focal points on what is important at a certain period in time. And so we need to just define the playing field which empower people to further develop our societies. And this should be the target. And we don't want to induce a certain good behavior. So you are focusing on good dialogue. We're doing this as well. So this is why we call upon you, ladies and gentlemen, in the audience. And so in case you should have any questions which you would like to have answered on stage now, this is your keyword. So this is voxr.com/dpd. So you know this app. Mr. Marks already started the survey with you. So please just type your questions in and I'll give you a few seconds. And then we are very much intrigued to find out what you are interested in. Here we go.
Sie sind nicht online.
You're not online. Maybe somebody can hand you a microphone in the good analog world. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ranhild Enslen. So with all the presentations which we've heard so far, I've been lacking one thing. For me, democracy starts in families. I'm a mother, and for me this is my day-to-day work in the relationship with the father of the child, in the relationship with everybody who's part of this family, to convey democracy to my child. And unfortunately, in this time, since I'm a mother, I have not have enough the feeling that people believe that families can convey this democratic values, the values for this democracy which I would like to live in, because children learn most in the very first years of their lives by what they experience, and every child who experiences democracy in the partnership can pass on democracy later on kind of into the genes, into the bloodstream, if you like, of its family, and can just bring those values on. So that's totally right. So what's your question? My question is why you haven't talked about this topic. I haven't heard of this topic of family as fertile ground for democracy. And so my question is how the federal government can support this topic. I, being a parent, not in the sense of how can I just, pass the responsibility for my child on to somebody else, but how can we live this in the families? Thanks a lot for the input. Would anybody like to react to this question? Well, I believe this is my job here as a family minister of Family Affairs. I don't remember your name, but yes, your contribution is a very important one. So the place where children are being molded is family. And so this is about how children are enabled to take certain decisions in a family or to be part of the decision-making processes. So on the one hand, it's important to talk about how we live together in societies, but on the other hand, also how we can support and promote families. So I don't want to say that this is only about making it possible, as you called it, that passing the child over to somebody else who should then take the responsibility for the child. No, but you have to have a good cooperation in families and also with police and social workers. So there needs to be, and with child care institutions, there need to be good cooperation between all of these individual institutions. So when we're talking about early childhood education, on the one hand, it's important to support families, but also institutions, kindergartens, daycares. We have to give children a say so that they learn every child has got the same voice, are as important as the other, and that this is conveyed to children, that they live in a community where one cares for another. This starts in the family and goes far beyond families. So today here at the German Congress on Crime Prevention, for us this is about how we can support those who work in this in their professional lives, to strengthen them. Certainly also how they can cooperate with families, with parents. So all the things you said are the basis for everything, but it goes far beyond that. And I believe that in daycare centers, in primary schools, everywhere where people come together, we have to ensure that those basic values, people are worth the same. Nobody is worth more than anybody else, that this is conveyed early on to children. And certainly, family is a very important place to do this. And I can tell you, the strong family law and the good daycare law, which we just launched this year, supports exactly these processes. So especially where people don't have enough money, where they have got existentialist problems, where they have got major worries, this is where people start to gain a certain level of trust in the state, so that they feel that they get support even if they have got a low income. So we've already set the framework, and now we need to implement these things. So as you have already talked about, there are different fields where we can become active. You have also asked many questions via your mobile phones, and so here's the cloud. So democracy building, and this is a topic which came up a lot in your questions, and here, this is one of the questions which have been asked. So how do you exactly define democracy building? And so this is about definition of concepts, maybe also what's the difference between democracy building and civic education. Well, the concept of democracy building is a kind of umbrella term which brings so many different other topics together, including civic education. But you always have to measure things with different standards. There are different measures, different strategies, different approaches. And I believe one of the important pillars of democracy building is civic education. The way we've developed it over the last past decades in Germany, not only as a state service, but also with a subsidiarity approach with hundreds of different active institutions, and which are not only practicing active civic education, but who are also working in an interdisciplinary way. So on the interface with social work, for example, intercultural education, and all of these things can be driven. And democracy building should aim at creating diversity in society, not ignoring conflicts, but rather discussing conflicts publicly and developing an attitude. And then there are those preventive approaches, for example, programs for people with an extremist position to leave their structures and to get away from that. So these are also prevention approaches. And we need to be aware of the fact that there's not only one single strategy, but many. Mr. Selen, well, if you ask somebody who is in charge of the protection of the Constitution, they will always talk about our free democratic basic order. So in our Constitution, in Articles 1 to 19, we already have got a very good instructions for democracy should work, but we need to now translate this into tangible lives. So this is not nothing which should collect dust in the bookshelf. You can describe people, you can quote Articles 1, 2, 3, but you can also translate this into actual lives. And this is what we need to do. This is the challenge which we need to live up to just make all of this tangible and to make it understandable to the addressees, not only with the words of our Constitution, but also in the living realities of the individuals. And so bringing democracy on the streets. So, I mean, this concept has been around for a long time, but the concept I'm talking about is translating this into life realities, into the different life realities in our society. So I don't want to be misunderstood here. So I don't want, at the end of the day, induce a certain positive behavior or an expected behavior of people. No, we want people to just engage in society with their personal subjective interests. So civic education defines itself as something which likes to sometimes even focus on resistance, that people just say, I'm against this. So all of these things need to be discussed, needs to be debated, and we cannot say we have got a certain security political interest, which should be the headline over everything, which then should be subsumized as civic education. Yes, certainly it makes sense to have diversity of opinions, especially in the social media. We see a reverse development, that suddenly one opinion is the dominating opinion, and that is the contrary of a democratic development. So I totally agree with what you are saying. We need more diversity. We need to make a discourse possible, and we also need to just live through a dialogue within our rules of the game in our democratic institutions. Wir haben auch englisch sprechende Gäste hier. Wenn irgendjemand gerne eine Frage auf Englisch stellen möchte, können Sie das auch tun und dann wird es gedolmetscht. Dann bringen wir Ihnen gerne das Mikro. Irgendjemand möchte jemand eine Frage auf Englisch stellen? Oh, da ist eine Frage auf Englisch. Vielen Dank. Guten Morgen an alle Anwesenden. aus Indien. Und wir arbeiten im Training von Polizisten für Prävention von Straftaten. Sie haben ganz großartig über Demokratie gesprochen. Sie haben darüber viele wichtige Sachen gesagt. Ich würde gerne wissen, Entschuldigung, ich habe ja ein Problem mit meinem Mikro. Ich würde gerne wissen, wie man eben genau das erreichen kann, dadurch, dass man öffentliche Partizipation in einem demokratischen Land unterstützt. Und wie Sie die Stimme der Bevölkerung hören, wie Sie das umsetzen. Gibt es hier eine Strategie zur Hilfe für Strafprävention? Also es gibt ja unheimlich viel Forschung zum Thema Prävention von Straftaten. Wie setzen Sie das hier in Deutschland um? Und eine andere Frage ist das Wohlbefinden von Familien und auch die Unterstützung von Frauen. Gibt es irgendwelche Initiativen bei Ihrem Ministerium für Prävention von Straftaten, insbesondere gegenüber kleinen Kindern? Herzlichen Dank für Ihr Input. Vielleicht beginnen wir mit der zweiten Frage. Minister, the second question was whether there are any initiatives from the side of the ministry to prevent crimes against young children. Maybe you can answer this one. Well, in the context of child protection, we have got a huge field and program, especially in the context of sexual abuse of young children. So last year, we took the decision that the independent commissioner for sexual abuse of young children this program will become a permanent one, and especially in the context of strengthening children, prevention in the field, strengthening children in saying no, giving children a right to their own body, and that we have got very targeted support here. And the other thing, for us, children's rights play a major role. So nearly 30 years ago, Germany became part of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. This is very important, and our current efforts focus on the fact of implementing the rights of the child as a basic and fundamental right in our constitution. We're working on that. This is already laid down in our coalition agreement. So this is what we're working for in order to create the legal framework, because once children's rights are a basic right in the constitution, so you are looking a little concerned, but we have got many institutions to support us there. For example, the Institution for the Protection of the Children. So the right of children of protection and of empowerment. And we bring this onto a very different level if we make this part of our constitution. So this is a current project which we have got in our current government. Thanks a lot. Round of applause for this one. Also wir haben das Recht des Kindes als einen Teil unserer staatlichen Politik bei uns. Und hier gibt es besonderen Schutz. Gleichzeitig gibt es auch einen weiteren Schutz für Jugendliche. Und das ist auch ein ganz, ganz wichtiges Gesetz. Und das ist ein Teil des Follow-ups der UN-Konvention, der Kinderrechtskonvention. Und dann gibt es noch verschiedene Ansätze, wie wir die Kinderrechte schützen können, insbesondere von Kindern, die bereits straffällig geworden sind oder die auch aus straffälligen Familien kommen. Und dann gibt es eben auch die Kinder, die Schutz brauchen. Hierfür haben wir also eine bestimmte Kommission in Indien. Herzlichen Dank. Das ist ganz wichtig, dass man einfach auch nochmal sieht, was in anderen Ländern geschieht, was es für verschiedene Erfahrungen in anderen Ländern gibt. Und wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe, war die erste Frage, wie man jetzt die Zivilbevölkerung besser einzubinden kann. So how we can promote crime prevention. So Mr. Krüger, maybe you can answer that question. Well, I'm not an expert in crime prevention, and so civic education defines itself broader than just crime prevention. So civic education always is a midterm and long-term educational process. So we don't expect anything to happen within a very short period of time, or that we don't expect a certain positive behavior, that we can trigger a certain positive behavior over a short period of time or mid period of time. But crime prevention is something which is done by the law enforcement agencies. So maybe Mr. Selen is the better person to answer that question.
So the colleagues from the police are here, and essentially we have good cooperation between crime prevention through the police crime prevention, but also through organizations such as the Weißer Ring, where it's about protecting victims, raising awareness for critical development. And something I really appreciate, and I think in Germany it's really quite ideal what we're doing here in that sense, is that we no longer look exclusively at who is responsible for what. Instead, we look at what are the problems and who could we join forces with to get things done. So we're not focusing so much on who's wearing what hat, but looking at how we can cooperate better. This is a real success story, which is quite rare in Europe, and I've noticed people really pricking up their ears when we talk about what's happening when it comes to crime prevention here in Germany and how many different forces we join, as it were. So that's really a good thing and really quite ideal in that sense. I noticed you were interested in this as well. Well, just thinking about the speeches that we had earlier on, there's some examples in Berlin, but you see it throughout Germany. There's this sort of networks for neighborhood crime prevention, with the municipalities coming together, but all of the other experts involved in this area meeting regularly, having regular jour fixed days where they discuss things, and that this has a preventative effect, which is not coming only from the perspective of crime prevention, but rather looking at the sort of various stakeholders working in the public administration, in the schools, in the social work, the police force, in an individual neighborhood, and everybody working together. And I think this kind of cooperation means you're taking public responsibility for what's happening. And it also dismantles some of the prejudices. That's been a very interesting experience. If you're in schools, for example, you know, the worry about dealing with the police is just gone now. We just had this example, you know, a police officer comes into the schoolyard, and that's a real event for the primary school children. And I think that's wonderful, you know, and these organizations, and we can also say that, for example, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution are a sort of canary in a coal mine, in the sense that we find certain critical developments before they happen. We see them at their inception. And of course, everyone has to decide what they're going to do within the framework of their actual powers, but it's not hierarchical. It's very much on an equal footing and everyone working together. And there's a real pragmatism that has sort of unfolded in all of the federal states here in Germany, and on a municipal level too. And then there's the example of the ministry that we've just heard from the minister, the question of youth welfare and social pedagogical work. We had a very interesting example early on, and that is the respect coaches here from Berlin's Neukölln district, where we are at the moment. And there's somebody nodding here, Mr. De Souza Martins, and I'd like to give you the floor as well. Of course, we'll be very interested in knowing what your work is about, and maybe you can tell us a bit about your challenges.
Dankeschön für die Einleitung und dass ich ein bisschen was aus der Arbeit hier vor Ort erzählen darf.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak to you. Adrian De Souza Martins, respect coach with youth ethnic group services here in Neukölln. We look at what's in place in the school already in terms of this kind of coaches, what we can add, and we sort of develop a prevention concept for each individual school and look at how we can best roll this out in the everyday life of the schools. And we basically offer our services from civic education people or others, and basically the Respect Coach program is strong because it makes it possible for us to help schools systematize their work, but also do some of the work for them by finding the right organization for what it is the school wants to do. It's based very much on personal networks, I suppose, between individual teachers and organizations of civic education. We can support individual teachers so they don't have to do everything themselves. And when we look at the services we're offering, we get a sense of how high need is for the students to talk about identity and cohesion, cooperation. There are all kinds of issues and questions that they raise, but there's also a lack of knowledge, we find. If they tend to reject people or groups of people, it's basically ignorance. And so this curiosity about this other lifestyle or this other group is actually really there, and we can get involved with that and create spaces for exchange, spaces for different groups to get to know one another. And sometimes we have some really interesting debates that come up, but we have to create a foundation for a kind of platform for this sort of exchange. And there it's about strengthening social skills that make it possible for these school children to articulate their opinions, to take another perspective and to accept that not everybody at the end of a discussion will necessarily go away with the same opinion, but that you just have to accept that people will have different views and to just sort of tolerate this difference of opinion. Maybe I could just say one thing to the panel as well, namely, as practitioners, you know, we're very connected among Respect coaches across Germany, not just in Berlin. We're involved in primary crime prevention, and our program focuses on primary prevention of religiously driven extremism. Now, what I see is that this focusing in the primary preventative area is an obstacle because there are places where there are Respect coaches doing things where right-wing extremism is actually a much bigger problem than religiously founded extremism. And it means that we're in danger of perpetrating stigmatism. So I would like to have a program like this be cross-phenomenon and not just and covering all extremism. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I think we saw each other at the kickoff event, actually. I agree with you entirely. I mean, at the end of the day, you can reduce it to the statement of it really doesn't matter what the motivation is. It doesn't matter where the insult comes from or where the stone is thrown. You know, the motivation, it's all, you know, incitement to hatred. I mean, you've got the students that you've got in any given school class, and you have to look at what their problems are. But one thing that's incredibly important, and we need to discuss this, we've got people for whom the things we're talking about here are so far away, they just don't have the access to what we're talking about here. And this whole sort of democracy building approach, that means that you first of all have to understand certain basics that we can't assume. You have to have a sense that you mean me. How often have I experienced it on the ground that people say to me, oh, you know, voting, that's not really my bag. Yes, it is your bag. Not just do you have the right to it, but you should do it. But overcoming that sort of threshold where you think, I can contribute, I can be part of this, you know, you have to get there. And we're talking about people who are very far away from the worlds of politics and policy making. And still then to look at how can we reach out to them and talking to them, you know, to sort of, you know, say, you live here, this is your life, but everything you're doing is politics, really. And it's important that your voice is heard and that there are other voices that can exist parallel to you. Not everyone agrees with you, and that's okay. But I'm going to take on board what you said, that it shouldn't just be focusing on religious motivated extremism, but also right-wing extremism. So in this specific case, money has been freed up for measures against religiously motivated extremism, but when we were creating the Respect courses program, or an anti-bullying expert is somebody who can also work in other areas. And of course, right-wing extremism plays a role too. And yes, it's part of the funding that we've structured it this way, but I agree with you that we need to open this and look at how we can work with any kinds of radicalization. And we agree with you entirely. I would certainly support you completely. Thank you for your work. I think it's important for all of us to bear in mind that even if we think about political issues all the time, we can't assume that everyone else does. So that's really important to just remind ourselves that. So it's been a really great talk that we've had up here. Unfortunately, we're running out of time here, so I would say we'll just have one final round very, very quickly, and I would like to hear from our panelists up here. What do we need in your eyes? Just very briefly. I'll start with you, Mr. Selen, to strengthen democracy. Well, I think we need to access the scope for action more in an analog and digital way. I think there are developments that are really quite worrying. If you look at the social media, particularly, there are sort of echo chambers taking place that are very far away from democratic ideas, and to bring discourse, to bring different opinions in some of these echo chambers is a challenge. You know, if people are talking with one another, they are more stable against extremism. But if they just live in their own little bubble and sort of withdraw from everyone else into that bubble, then it becomes very dangerous. So it'd be important to look at how we can pop some of these digital bubbles in the social media world. And it's also affecting the analog world too. So we need to talk to one another more. Thank you. Minister? Well, we need to have a better media protection law. We need to have a better child and welfare law. The people who work in these areas have to be paid properly, and they have to have permanent, proper jobs so that they have job security and can do their work. And it's not just when it comes to project funding and child and youth welfare work. We need to have people working in areas that involve the police as well. So the people who work in these areas, the cooperation between the various different stakeholders, and that means we need to have legal frameworks that make it possible for us to get these things financed long-term together. And it's clear that those working in that area, if they only have to think about whether their project is going to ensure they have an income till the end of the year, that takes away energy that could be used better, and that's not a good thing. So I'd like to have a law for building and supporting democracy so that these things are financed long-term and have a legal basis, because the job will not disappear. As long as we have democracy, we will have people who are hostile to it. And that's the reason why we also have other people who are supported to do their job. So we have to ensure that they can. And I hope that we will have a signal coming out of this Congress in that regard. Thank you. Mr. Krüger, looking at you, I feel like you'd like something else to strengthen democracy. What would that be? Well, I think there are lots of different aspects, but one of the key ones is the question of resources. Resources for doing what we have talked about today have to be earmarked constantly, and it can't be a sinus curve, sometimes more, sometimes less, just in response to changes in the fortune of the country as a whole in this regard, easing up when you think things are better. So the role of strengthening democracy building in schools is important. As part of the PISA process, we saw that political history, social studies basically didn't do so well. Now, this is where you teach many different things. There are lots of lessons taught by teachers who aren't specialized in that area, where lots of lessons are cancelled. But the point is, you can't see of students just being ordinary people when they leave. They have to become political animals. That's what you're trying to make them be. And you can't have democracy without democrats. So it's really important that we learn how to tolerate different positions and appreciate different positions in a democracy. So that means if you have an environmentally, socially minded person, then it has to be part of what you do, that you have an awareness of democracy and you are able to stand conservative positions and vice versa. I think this categorization that we're seeing in different extremisms would just disappear if we don't understand that we are Democrats on a democratic spectrum and need to cooperate with one another, getting a sense of the bigger picture and tolerating and appreciating controversiality and not having a false harmony. That's the one thing. And another in this connection is to make it clear that we have to have an equal interest in everyone on the democratic spectrum to block extremism of all forms. So we have to find a common position on this. And I think we can all learn from one another over the course of the German Congress on Crime Prevention, the DPT. Thank you very much. And I'm going to give the floor now to Mr. Marx.
Well, the only thing I can say, thank you, Ms. Bauer, for the moderation, Minister, Mr. Krüger, and Mr. Selen. So this is worth another round of applause. I would cordially like to thank, and also this is worth a round of applause, the Berlin Babylon Orchestra. Beautiful music. And then the only thing which remains to be said, I received so many different notes. We haven't talked about Istanbul Convention, not about schools, not about drugs, not about violence vis-a-vis emergency services and forces. These things happen. These things we will encounter all of those topics here at the Congress. So enjoy, just look into the topics, learn a lot, and enjoy the music.